Last week, I began a short series of sermons that I'm calling Christian Distinctiveness. When I speak of distinctiveness, I am saying that out in the world, there should be a distinctiveness about us that is like the distinctiveness of Jesus Christ, a distinctiveness about us that draws attention to God out in the world. And this morning I'm going to talk about an aspect of our distinctiveness, or really a metaphor used to speak of our distinctiveness, that you're all familiar with, that you've all heard since you were a child in Sunday school, that we've all sang songs about as a child. And you're going to be familiar with the metaphor, but I'm really going to assume, for the most part, that you're familiar with the metaphor and really get into what it means and how, in practicality, it plays out in our lives as we are out there in the world. Now, Jesus says this, as it's recorded in Luke chapter 8 and verse 16. He says, "No one after lighting a lamp covers it with a vessel or puts it under a bed, but puts it on a stand, that those who enter may see the light. For nothing is hid that shall not be made manifest, nor anything secret that shall not be made known and come to light." Now, you know there's a song about that. What is it? You put your finger up, and this little light of mine. I wish I could sing. I would just sing it for you, but I can't, and I won't torture you that way. But it's what I find very, very interesting about this passage. Don's still laughing. Goodness. About this passage in chapter 8, beginning in 16, is that Jesus says this again. Or I should say, he probably says it multiple times throughout his ministry, but Luke records another instance of this in this same gospel. And there's some interpretation, some application, I should say, the next time Jesus says this. Now, if you just take this first verse right here, verse 16, "No one after lighting a lamp covers it with a vessel or puts it under a bed, but puts it on a stand that those who enter may see the light." You can turn to chapter 11, verse 33. Now, listen how close this is. "No one after lighting a lamp puts it in a cellar or under a bushel, but on a stand that those who enter may see the light." So you see those two verses are parallel. And you find this verse 17 then that we read right here in chapter 8, "For nothing is hid that shall not be made manifest, nor anything secret that shall not be made known and come to light." You find that one a very similar case to that one as well, but you find that in chapter 12 in verse 2. "Nothing is covered up that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be made known." So you see, these same verses are essentially repeated, and Luke records this instance, but in between these two verses, it's packed full of application. So this morning, I'm going to assume that you're pretty familiar with this metaphor of being the light in the world, and I'm going to talk very specifically then about the application, as the metaphor light is just that, a metaphor of our distinctiveness out in the world. As our light shines out in the world, that's what we're talking about. So here we find out then how Jesus applies these things. So then we go on to verse 34 in chapter 11. And Jesus says, "Your eye is the lamp of your body. When your eye is sound, your whole body is full of light. But when it is not sound, your body is full of darkness. Therefore be careful lest the light in you be darkness. If then your whole body is full of light, having no part dark, it will be wholly bright, as when a lamp with its rays gives you light." So he's saying there, what this really means, he's talking about your eye, and what he's talking about here is an eye that has its sights set on a particular thing. An eye that is set singularly and wholeheartedly in one direction. And that direction is to God. that direction is to and toward the will of God. As you look out and set your eye on that alone, your whole self will be full of this light. And as you set your eye on that alone and you become full of light, then you emit light. So that when you're in the world then, as you have your eyes completely set on doing the whole will of God, you emit light in the world. But he's saying also there is something that can hinder this light from coming forth from you. It's if you get your eyes set on the wrong thing, if you get your sights in life set in the wrong direction. And what can happen then, you can be a hindrance. You can actually be then a darkness in the world. And he deals with one specific element of darkness that I think he expounds in this. If you jump forward to verse 1 of chapter 12. The things that he is about to begin to speak about here, I believe he kind of sums them up with one word. And we're going to kind of break these apart, these individual elements, but this is the word. Chapter 12, verse 1, in the meantime, when so many thousands of the multitude had gathered together, that they trod upon one another, he began to say to the disciples first, beware the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Hypocrisy. So I believe that he's telling us, be careful. Because hypocrisy can be this darkness. Hypocrisy can be the thing that douses the light. It can be the thing that hinders light from shining out into the world through your life or through the church's life. So all these things in the interim here that he speaks about, I think could be summed up as hypocrisy. And just a few weeks ago, I told you a statistic of how the world, the younger generations in particular, view the church. I'm not talking about just First Christian Church. I'm talking about the church. And that 85% of the younger generations, my age and below, would call the church hypocritical. That's just their initial judgment, what they assume about us, what they think they see in us. So it might behoove us then to know what Jesus calls hypocrisy and stay far from it, so that we can recognize it by looking at what Jesus says here and stay away from it, so that we would not accurately be defined as hypocritical. Verse 37. While he was speaking, a Pharisee asked him to dine with him. So he went in and sat at table. The Pharisee was astonished to see that he did not first wash before dinner. Now the Pharisees had a very specific ritual that they would wash all the way to their elbows in a certain way. They would use a towel and argue. They even argued about where the towel was supposed to be placed after they did it. Very particular about this ritual washing. And this is really a representative of them in that they were very particular about a lot of rituals. Very concerned about those things that people see you do. So they looked at Jesus and saw that he didn't do it. He didn't measure up to their standards by what they could see. Very concerned these Pharisees were about what people could see them do. And the Lord said to him, now you Pharisees cleanse the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside you are full of extortion and wickedness. You fools, did not he who made the outside make the inside also? But give for alms those things which are within, and behold, everything is clean for you. So he's saying, look, there's an outside. People can see it. People sure they can see you washed right. People sure they can see that you took care of all these rituals that you have. They can see that you've met all of these regulations that you've interpreted the Scriptures to say. But there's something they can't see right off that's inside. And he said, if you get that right in the inside, the outside will take care of itself. So start with the inside. Because, yeah, they were forcing all these outside, these external things so that when people would look at them, they would have a high opinion of them. But, on the other hand, they were out, he says, full of extortion and wickedness. Extortion means that they were willing to go to unjust means to get gain for themselves. They were willing to exploit people to raise their own standard of living. They were willing to exploit systems, probably religious systems, as a means to raise their own standard of living. They were willing to practice extortion. They had wickedness inside of them, which prevented any real light from shining forth from them. There are 6 woes that Jesus says here. When he says, woe to you, he's saying, it's a terrible thing. I'm sorry that this has come about. But the outcome of this is going to be a terrible thing for you. That's what he's really saying when he says, woe to you. And there are 6 woes that he mentions here. He mentions the first 3 specifically to the group of Pharisees as a whole. He mentions the second group of 3 to a specific group of the Pharisees, which were called lawyers or scribes. They were the ones who interpreted and copied the Scriptures. They were the ones who were considered to be the finest experts in the Old Testament law. But first he addresses the Pharisees at large. And these, I would say to you, are indications of hypocrisy. But woe to you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and every herb, and neglect justice and love of God. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. Woe to you, he says, because, there's a law that says to tithe, and he's saying you've got tithing down to the most minute, trivial thing. Melissa grows herbs right outside of our door over there. You walk over there, and I don't even know what they're all called, but she goes out there when we eat, right before we eat, and she clips some of this off, and puts it in our food, and I don't know what it is, but I eat it. And that's what they're doing there, in their little gardens outside of their doors, just like that. They're clipping off every 10th stalk of those herbs. Every 10th one. Very particular about that, and they were bringing it in to tithe of it. Now, I don't think that God's altogether concerned about that. He's saying you shouldn't neglect tithing, but this is getting a little ridiculous. Would you expect Melissa to go out and clip off every 10th stalk and bring it over? Or would you even think of it? They were very concerned about that, but they were not at all concerned about these things that Jesus says right here. Justice and love of God. The justice and love of God was being completely neglected. Now, Matthew, in this same parallel incident here, when he records it, he says also mercy and faith. So they were neglecting justice and love of God. They were neglecting mercy. They were neglecting matters of faith just so they could get the regulations taken care of. So for them, their faith, their religion, I should say, had become more about measuring up to the regulations than about being with God, than about doing what God was concerned about. It was more concerned about rules than it was about people. And I believe that as we go on through these woes, that every one of them, we could say, look, you're doing this, but you've neglected justice and the love of God. We could say that with every one. So that as life then becomes infused with religion, it can never be concerned, as I said last week, more with attending to religious practices than practicing our religion. Practicing our religion means to be concerned about matters of faith, mercy, justice, and the love of God. But they have forgone all these things so that they could focus on attending to their religious practices. Woe to you, Pharisees, for you love the best seats in the synagogues and salutations in the marketplaces. They were getting the best seats and the salutations from the people, not because they loved the people, not because they have shown mercy, not because they have been just, but because outwardly they looked religious, because outwardly they had created a system of religious practices that they could live up to and distinguish themselves. Distinguish themselves. They were drawing attention to themselves because of their superior ability to measure up to these regulations and doing it outwardly so people could see it. But if they would have just attended to mercy, justice, love, and matters of faith, they would have been drawing attention to the living God. So that's what we should be doing, drawing attention to God. Verse 44, he says, "Woe to you, for you are like graves, which are not seen, and men walk over them without knowing it. For them, they were unclean." Internally, the Pharisees were unclean. No matter how well they washed their hands and arms before they ate, no matter how well they did at practicing their rituals, they were unclean, full of extortion and wickedness. And for them, the Pharisees, they would refuse to walk across a grave or near a grave of a person because that made them ceremonially unclean. If they came into contact with a tomb, if they came into contact with a dead person, if they came into contact with a grave, they would be ceremonially unclean and unable to participate in the religious worship there at the temple. And Jesus is saying, you Pharisees are like those tombs, because people come into contact with you, and unknowingly they're coming into contact with unclean people. Just like you might unknowingly come into contact with an unmarked grave and become ceremonially unclean, people who come into contact with you are coming into contact with uncleanness. You are like those tombs yourselves. You are so unclean. You are hypocritical. And then Jesus turns now to the lawyers. One of the lawyers answers him, "Teacher, in saying this, you reproach us also." Really? Can you imagine that? And he said, "Woe to you lawyers also, for you load men with burdens hard to bear, and you yourselves do not touch the burdens with one of your fingers." Now, these lawyers, scribes, Pharisees, they interpreted the Old Testament and built up a system of regulations upon regulations upon regulations, so that it was a full-time job just to stand up and measure up to these regulations that they had developed. It really probably was a full-time preoccupation to meet the requirements of these trifles. The average person simply could not do it. There's no way the average person in the average life could measure up to all of these trifles that they had stacked one on top of the other. And then they would stand back and say, look at us. We're doing it. But look at you, lowlife. You're not doing it. And it was never a matter of, oh, let us help you come to God. It was a matter of, sorry, you don't measure up. You don't measure up. Now, I'm going to bring some application here. And it's not like I'm going to say this and say, yes, First Christian Church, we are like this. I'm saying that these kinds of problems exist in the church, and that we should be aware, that we should be on guard, because there is a generation out there that would call us hypocritical. And here's just an illustration. Well, first I should start off is that we're called hypocritical And 85% of people outside the church and younger generations would call us hypocritical. But 87% call us judgmental. That's the way they term us, judgmental. And this word that Luke chooses, that gets translated justice, when he says you have neglected justice and the love of God, is really, the word itself in the Greek language is judgment. You have neglected judgment. And I think what he's really saying here is not that you have to exact justice according to a strict law. Somebody messes up, condemn them. He's not saying that. He's saying you have neglected to judge like God judges, full of mercy and love. If he didn't judge, full of mercy and love, where would you be? Where would I be? But there's a generation out there that looks at us and says that we are judgmental in that we condemn people. And I'm going to read to you an illustration here, just to exemplify this mentality. You know what really bothered me, the young woman Lisa confessed during a recent interview. I was grateful for the frank thoughts of this 29-year-old mother of 2 toddlers. Well, you were asking how Christians come across to me. I'll tell you. A few weeks ago, I visited a Christian Bible study at a church. Every once in a while, I go because I know a few of the women. You know, I am still trying to figure out this Jesus thing. After the speaker talked for a while, we started a conversation at our table. About 8 or 9 of us women were chatting away. I was probably the youngest one there, but some of them were about my age. We all got along pretty well. What happened that bothered you? We were talking about sex, intimacy, and pregnancy, stuff like that. I told them about a friend of mine who was considering an abortion. I told them of her entire situation. A 20-year-old boyfriend left her. She's feeling really alone. I made some comment about really empathizing with my friend, that I could understand that abortion might make sense. I guess that shocked them. I know the women there are pro-life and all. I don't know what I am, pro-life or pro-choice or just myself. But the conversation shifted at that point in a really weird way. Instead of having a dialogue, I was put on the defensive. They were nice enough about it, but the ladies just kept talking at me, trying to fix my attitude about abortion. Lisa paused and softened her tone. And here's the part that bothered me, something I never told them. What they didn't know is that I had an abortion a long time ago. It was not an experience I would wish on anyone, but I can feel my friend's dilemma because I lived it. I'm not sure the Christians I hung out with that morning get that. I guess the truth is, I was hoping for some empathy myself. I was hoping for some empathy myself. And I think that this is the problem that the Pharisees failed at. They lacked empathy. Oh, they could get all the rules right themselves. But they lacked empathy for the person who struggled to get it all together. And Jesus says this, listen to this. You load men with burdens hard to bear, and you yourselves do not touch the burdens with one of your fingers. How about us? People out there are loaded with burdens. They're loaded with burdens just by being confronted with the truth. How do we respond to that? Do we talk at them like these ladies did to Lisa? Do we empathize with her in mercy and love? What do we do? Do we, with one of our fingers, try to lift the load? Think about that. Think about the people you're involved with. Are we doing that? Lifting the load with what person and with what finger? Are we literally doing this in the world that we might be the light? Jesus goes on, "Woe to you, for you build the tombs of the prophets whom your fathers killed. So you are witnesses and consent to the deeds of your fathers, for they killed them, and you build their tombs. Therefore also the wisdom of God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill and persecute, that the blood of all the prophets shed from the foundation of the world may be required of this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, it shall be required of this generation." Now that's a little bit harder to apply to us because we don't kill too many prophets and apostles. Their ancestors did, and they would continue to do it. And he's saying, look, you're participating in it. Look, you're going to be held accountable for it. Why? Because you say you don't approve of what was being done to those prophets by the very fact that you build monuments to them. They were already in tombs, but during that day, they would build these elaborate tombs. They would build monuments to the loss of these prophets. But Jesus is saying, look, you're going to be sent more prophets, more apostles, and you're going to kill them. And by doing that, you will have participated in the whole of it historically. You're a hypocrite. In a sense, you're honoring these dead prophets that your fathers killed, but you're going to kill some too. And by killing them, you have participated in the whole of it. Now, we don't kill prophets, do we? But I think there is something we have to be careful with as the church. Something that would cause people to call us hypocritical. And I'm going to shock some of you probably with this statement. But think about this. Think about this. Think about the Germans and the Jews. How do we feel about that? Over 5 million Jews killed. And we condemn it. And we build monuments to it, to them, because we have condemned it. The Jews, or the Germans, killed Jews to get their way in the world. Just killed them. Over 5 million. We call it a travesty. We build monuments. But think about this. 1.2 million Iraqis have been killed so far. How does the church respond to something like that? 1.2 Iraqis killed. How do we respond to that? Are we okay with that? Are we say, yeah, a Christian nation did that? Or are we embarrassed to say a Christian nation had anything to do with that? How many millions have to be killed before we build a monument to the Iraqi lives that have been lost? People would call us hypocritical because we do that. Jesus goes on. Woe to you, lawyers, for you have taken away the key of knowledge. You did not enter yourselves, and you hindered those who are entering. The key to this. What is the key to this? They have made it a system of rules to measure up to. But you know what it really is? It's the living God. A God who wants to be in relationship with us. That's what it's about. And we can go out into the world and have a system of rules and regulations, have a way to tell people they're wrong. Or it can be about a living God who is about justice and mercy and love and faithfulness. If that's really what it's about, we will enter into the world making judgments like God makes them. We will enter into the world showing compassion and mercy like God shows it. We will enter into the world loving like God has loved. And we have only to look to the life of Jesus Christ to know what that looks like. That's all we have to do. And go out and do it. And by that, we will be distinctive in the world. And by that, we will bring people into the kingdom instead of hinder them from being able to see the kingdom by those things. So we go out into the world. Lights as a lamp. So that when we go out, we're showing this love, mercy, justice. And one thing about a light, and we really need to apply it to ourselves here. Can we say how we are doing that? I mean pinpoint it in the world. Can we say how we are doing that as individuals right now? If you could just ask yourself, ask the Lord, am I doing this? In what way? With what person am I doing it? Or we can ask, is this church, the congregation, doing this in Clemmons? Are we a light? I think we are. And this really encourages me. And this comes from halfway around the world in a way that we have participated in. This is from Myanmar. A tribe told one of our partners, and he's talking about AIDS, which we gave money to last month. We want to be Christians. Christians are very good. They came and rescued us. They feed us. They clothe us. They love us. That encourages me because I know that we were a part of that. And that's what I'm talking about. And I would like to see that some very distinguished way this would be happening with this congregation in this community. And I think that Jesus, if he was here today, he might say something like this. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it behind stained glass windows or under a steeple, but on a stand, that those who enter may see the light. Let's pray.